The sea air was warm and tinged with the scent of salt and freedom as Gwenda Reed stepped off the boat and onto English soil. Newly married and full of dreams, she was eager to leave behind the crowded chaos of India and settle into a quiet, picturesque life on the southern coast of England. Though her husband, Giles, would follow her shortly, Gwenda had taken it upon herself to find a house, something simple but charming, a place to begin their future together. She found it rather quickly, a quaint Victorian villa nestled in the sleepy town of Dilmouth. With its ivy-covered exterior and sea views, Hillside was practically whispering home to her from the very first visit. It wasn't grand or impressive, but it had a soul. Something about it felt oddly familiar. The real estate agent, friendly and accommodating, had seemed surprised when she'd asked to see inside. It had been unoccupied for years, left to gather dust in silence, yet remained in remarkable condition. Gwenda couldn't put her finger on it, but something tugged at her from the corners of her mind as she wandered through the rooms. There were peculiar moments. For instance, she knew, without quite knowing how, that there had once been a door between the drawing room and the hall, though it was now sealed. And when she began imagining renovations, she found herself choosing colors and furnishings with a sense of déjà vu, as though recalling rather than inventing. Still, she brushed it off. She was being fanciful. Surely, the mind played tricks when wrapped in the warm, nostalgic cloak of English countryside charm. Once she moved in, the little oddities only grew stranger. She found herself instinctively avoiding the stairs at night, her hand lingering on the banister like muscle memory. She knew where the light switches were in the dark. And one day, while exploring the garden, she unearthed a portion of paving stones laid out like a path. Again, something she already suspected was there. It wasn't until she began to prepare a guest room that the first real shock struck. She had chosen some simple wallpaper with pale flowers and delicate vines. But as the rolls were delivered and she held them up against the walls, her breath caught in her throat. The image was identical to the wallpaper she had already envisioned in that room, down to the faintly curling leaves near the ceiling border. A wild chill ran through her. Why did she know this house so well? Had she seen it before, perhaps in a magazine or a book? Had she visited it in her childhood? But she had spent most of her early years abroad. Her parents had both died when she was just a toddler, and she'd grown up in the care of relatives far from England. There was no way she could have been here. And yet, the sensation grew stronger. Memories not quite her own flitted through her mind. Snatches of a woman's voice, the feeling of running down the hallway as a child, the sense of something terrible once whispered in the walls of Hillside. Startled and unnerved, Gwenda decided to get away for a few days. London called. A chance to visit with friends, clear her head, and immerse herself in the living buzz of city life. It was there, at a cozy dinner party hosted by her cousin Raymond West and his ever-inquisitive guest, Miss Jane Marple, that the mystery of Gwenda's unsettling familiarity began to unravel. Miss Marple, with her delicate lace gloves and deceptively kind eyes, had noticed something in Gwenda's manner, something unresolved. When the young woman hesitantly shared her strange experiences at Hillside, Miss Marple listened intently, her mind spinning through decades of human experience and unsolved puzzles. "There is, I think," Miss Marple said softly, "a very simple explanation and a very dangerous one." It was in that moment the tone shifted, as though the past had stirred awake. Miss Marple, who had long understood that evil often lingered just beneath the surface of domestic serenity, saw the signs. Something had happened at Hillside long ago, something that had embedded itself in the very bones of the house. And Gwenda, unknowingly, had come home to it. When Gwenda woke the next morning in Raymond's London home, the previous night's conversation with Miss Marple echoed through her thoughts like the last lines of an unfinished novel. There had been something both comforting and unsettling in the way the elderly woman had spoken. Softly, precisely, with a kind of sharpness that cut to the fog of disbelief. Over breakfast, Raymond was casual and amused. "A little haunted house hysteria, my dear, happens to all new homeowners. It's probably just nerves." He was a writer, after all, inclined to dismiss real-life mysteries as quaint anecdotes at best. But Miss Marple? She had not laughed. Her blue eyes, old and observant, had remained thoughtful. Gwenda could still hear her words. Sometimes the mind detects us from truths we aren't ready to remember. But once a door is opened, Gwenda wasn't sure if the door had already opened, or she had been standing in it all along. The trio spent the day walking the shaded streets of London, browsing bookstores and sipping tea. But it wasn't until that evening at the theater that the past truly intruded upon the present. They had chosen a murder mystery, a light diversion. The audience gasped as the villain strangled a young woman on stage. But Gwenda did not gasp. She froze. As the actress fell back onto the settee, eyes wide in death, a scream lodged in Gwenda's throat. Not one of shock at the scene, but of recollection. Her vision blurred, and in its place came a vivid image. A woman with pale hands and golden hair lying limp against a chair. Her mouth open in a silent plea. Her neck bruised where fingers had pressed too tightly. Gwenda bolted from her seat and ran into the corridor, trembling, barely able to breathe. Raymond followed her, frantic. "Gwenda, what is it?" "I saw her," she gasped. "I saw her dying. I've seen it before. That exact moment. Not in the play, in real life. I was there. I saw someone murdered." The shock in Raymond's face was real this time. He steadied her as Miss Marple arrived, calm but alert. "Tell me everything," she said gently. In halting, breathless detail, Gwenda described the vision, the pattern of the dress, the way the room looked, the echo of a man's voice calling a name, Helen. "It was real," she insisted. "I must have seen it as a child. That house is not just familiar. I lived there before. I saw that woman murdered in that house." Miss Marple nodded, not surprised, only thoughtful. The wallpaper, the path in the garden, the door in the hallway. "Yes, you're remembering." The next day, Gwenda returned to Hillside with Miss Marple by her side. Together, they walked its rooms, the old floorboards creaking beneath their steps. Each turn of the hallway, each glance at the corners of the drawing room, stirred more fragments in Gwenda's memory, like puzzle pieces rising to the surface. In the garden, near the flower bed she had been so inexplicably drawn to, Miss Marple paused. "Tell me, dear," she said. "Who was Helen?" Gwenda closed her eyes, and the name became a whisper in her mind. "I think she was my stepmother." The revelation fell between them like a dropped stone. Gwenda had always believed her mother had died when she was a baby, and her father, Kelvin Halliday, had passed away soon after marrying a woman named Helen, but she had never known the full details. Until now, they dug into old records, aided by Miss Marple's resourceful curiosity. Newspaper clippings, property archives, birth certificates. Each one added another layer to a buried story. What they discovered was chilling. Helen Halliday had vanished without explanation. No obituary. No record of emigration. Simply gone. And shortly afterward, Kelvin Halliday had left the country with young Gwenda in tow, moving to New Zealand. He had died there, his past unspoken, his secrets left to rot in the soil of Hillside. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing room of Hillside, knitting in her lap, a thoughtful frown on her face. "Your father may have thought he was protecting you," she said, "but the mind does not always cooperate, especially with children. You saw something, Gwenda. Something so awful is buried for your safety. But it's coming back now because it never truly left." The house, Gwenda realized, was not just her home. It was a scene of a crime. And the killer might still be out there, free, unknown, and perhaps even watching. It was a realization that chilled her to the bone. But with Miss Marple at her side, Gwenda knew one thing for certain. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, would not stay asleep forever. They had awakened something at Hillside, and soon they would discover whether the past was a ghost or a killer still walking in the light of day. The garden at Hillside had become more than a place of peace for Gwenda. It was now the heart of her unease. What had once seemed a charming corner filled with rose bushes and sun-dappled stone now felt heavy with hidden memories. Each flower bed whispered secrets, and each step seemed to echo the past. Miss Marple, never one to dismiss the instincts of disturbed heart, took a particular interest in the garden path Gwenda had uncovered. They stood there together. One woman young and trembling with the weight of half-formed memories, the other old, precise, and wise in the way of human darkness. You say you saw a woman, Helen, lying dead. Did you see what happened before? Miss Marple asked gently. Gwenda closed her eyes. The image returned, fuzzy at first, then painfully clear. There was an argument, a man's voice furious. I was on the stairs, just above the landing. She was crying. She wanted to leave, but he wouldn't let her. And then something snapped. Miss Marple gave a thoughtful nod. And the garden? Did it come into play in any way? Gwenda hesitated. I don't know, except that I always thought that particular patch of ground looked wrong, as though something had once been there, and someone tried to hide it. It was all Miss Marple needed to act. With the help of a local gardener, an old friend of the Hallidays named Dr. James Kennedy, who had lived in Dilmouth for decades, they began a careful, respectful excavation near the roses. What they found buried a few feet beneath the soil was no longer fully whole, but its implications were unmistakable. A faded piece of fabric with a delicate floral pattern. Beneath it, a few strands of long, pale hair, and then, unmistakably bone, fragile, weathered, human. The police were summoned, and the garden was cordoned off. Miss Marple watched the slow uncover with an expression of both sorrow and vindication. What Gwenda had remembered was not just a dream or childish fancy. It was a murder long buried, and not metaphorically. The remains were confirmed to be female, consistent with a young woman around the age Helen Halliday would have been at the time of her disappearance. While dental records were scarce in that period, an old photograph provided by one of Helen's surviving relatives helped confirm what everyone feared. The body was hers. Gwenda felt a strange combination of horror and relief. The house had kept its secret for years, sleeping, festering beneath the surface. And now, with its grave disturbed, it had begun to speak. Dr. Kennedy, the kindly physician who had served the area for decades, was visibly shaken when informed of the discovery. I remember Helen, he said slowly, over tea in the drawing room. She was very lovely, bright-eyed, gentle, a bit quiet, perhaps, but always kind. Did you see her often? Miss Marple inquired. Only socially. The Hallidays didn't socialize much. Kelvin was, well, intense, overprotective, even possessive. I always had the sense that Helen wasn't entirely happy. Miss Marple sipped her tea, then asked, Did you ever suspect anything after she disappeared? Dr. Kennedy paused. We were told she'd left him, gone to London. Perhaps, he said, she couldn't take the isolation anymore. I suppose we believed him. He left soon after, took Gwenda, and vanished abroad. But you didn't question the suddenness? He frowned. Looking back, yes, but at the time, we wanted to believe there was nothing sinister. After all, it was just after the war. People came and went. New beginnings, you know? Miss Marple's expression darkened. Or permanent endings. The case was now a murder investigation, one long gone cold, now abruptly burning again. But the trouble was, Kelvin Halliday, the most obvious suspect, had died years ago. With his death, had the mystery also died? Miss Marple didn't think so. She always said that in human affairs, death never erased the full truth. It simply buried it beneath new lies. And there were still people alive who had been close to the Hallidays at the time. Old friends, former neighbors, the staff who had worked at Hillside. Each one, Miss Marple believed, might hold a fragment of the whole. And so, she and Gwenda began to dig. Not in the garden now, but in the memories of those who had once known Helen Halliday. Meanwhile, Gwenda struggled with another layer of pain. If her father had killed Helen, had he been protecting her by leaving England or protecting himself? Had the loving, gentle man she remembered been capable of such horror? Miss Marple, in her calm way, offered comfort with her insight. Good people can do very bad things when fear takes hold, especially when they believe they're out of choices. But Miss Marple also had a suspicion, one she kept to herself for now, because something still didn't add up. Helen Halliday had been a ghost for so long that even those who once knew her had begun to question whether she had ever truly existed. But now, with her body uncovered in the garden at Hillside, she demanded to be remembered, not just as a victim, but as a woman whose life had been quietly erased one carefully hidden truth at a time. Miss Marple believed that to find the killer, they first needed to find Helen. Not her bones in the soil, but her story, who she was, where she came from, and what had happened in the days before she vanished. And so began the careful work of piecing together a life from fragments. Gwenda and Miss Marple began their inquiries in Dilmouth, starting with the local registry office and old parish records. Bit by bit, Helen's past emerged. Born Helen Kennedy, yes, Dr. James Kennedy's sister, she had grown up in the very town where she died. The daughter of a vicar, educated modestly, she had been known for her gentleness and grace. "Such a lovely girl," said Mrs. Cocker, a retired schoolteacher who had taught Helen as a child. "Quiet, yes, but full of compassion. She used to stay behind after class just to tidy up the room." Helen had worked briefly at the local library and had sung in the church choir. She had dreams once of studying literature, perhaps writing a novel of her own. But then everything changed when she met Kelvin Halliday. Kelvin had come to Dilmouth from London, a widower still grieving his first wife. He was a brooding man, intense, articulate, and, most dangerously, charming. To a young woman like Helen, he must have seemed mysterious, even romantic. They were married quickly, a small ceremony attended by a few close friends and her brother James. From that day forward, she moved into Hillside, and slowly, the girl who had sung in the choir vanished from public life. "I hardly saw her after the wedding," said Mrs. Cocker. It was as if she'd been swallowed. Dr. Kennedy, when pressed by Miss Marple, admitted that he and Helen had grown apart after her marriage. Kelvin wasn't keen on family visits, said he preferred privacy. I assumed it was grief. Now I wonder if it was guilt. But Miss Marple sensed something deeper beneath that statement. She watched him carefully as he spoke, noticed the hesitation, the tightness around the eyes, the way his hand trembled ever so slightly as he stirred his tea. He knew more than he was letting on. Later, Gwenda asked Miss Marple directly, "Do you think my father killed her?" Miss Marple paused. "That's the question, isn't it? He's the most likely suspect. Certainly. The argument you remembered, his sudden departure with you to New Zealand. But something about this feels more tangled." Gwenda frowned. "Tangled how?" "Well," Miss Marple said, knitting slowly as she spoke, "Helen was Dr. Kennedy's sister. If she vanished suddenly, surely he would try to find her, wouldn't he? But he didn't. He accepted Kelvin's explanation. Why? What was he protecting or hiding? That line of thought opened a new angle. Miss Marple suggested they revisit Dr. Kennedy under guise of friendship. They found him in his study, a warm fire burning despite the spring air. He was cordial but guarded. Miss Marple admired the books lining his shelves, commenting on a volume of medical ethics. "A doctor's conscience must be a heavy burden sometimes," she said softly. He looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. "We all do what we think is best, especially for those we love." That was it. Just a few words. But they told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. Dr. Kennedy had known, or at least suspected, something all those years ago. After they left his home, she turned to Gwenda and said, "He's not just grieving sister. He's keeping a secret." And secrets, as Miss Marple knew too well, were like seeds. They always grew into lies, into consequences, into crimes. That evening, Gwenda sat on the stairs at Hillside, the same stairs she stood on as a child, watching the final moments of a woman's life. The wallpaper had changed, but the shadows were the same. The silence pressed around her. "I keep thinking," she said to Miss Marple, who sat nearby, "what if he didn't kill her? What if someone else was in the house that night? Someone I didn't see or someone I've forgotten?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Or someone you've misremembered." That night, Gwenda had another dream, one more vivid than any before. Helen again, crying, begging someone to let her go. A man's shadow tall looming. But this time, something was different. The voice yelling wasn't her father's. It was someone else. And that changed everything. The air in Dr. James Kennedy's study was thick with memories. The walls lined with books and framed certificates gave off an aura of dignity. But beneath that surface was a tension that Miss Marple recognized instinctively. She had seen it before, in grieving widows and guilty sons, in those who had lived too long with a truth they dared not speak aloud. After Gwenda's vivid dream, the one that suggested a different voice, a different figure looming in the shadows, Miss Marple knew it was time to revisit the most subtle player in this puzzle, Dr. Kennedy. This time, she came alone. She found him seated by the fireplace, a book forgotten in his lap. When she entered, he looked up with the composed weariness of a man who had long feared a moment just like this. "Miss Marple," he greeted softly, "I imagine this isn't a social call." "No," she replied gently. "It's not." He gestured to a chair. She sat. The crackle of the fire filled the silence for a long moment before she spoke again. "I've known grief," she began, her voice low and measured. "I've known what it means to lose someone and feel powerless. But I've also known that grief can drive people to do desperate things they carry forever." Kennedy's fingers tightened on the arm of his chair. Miss Marple continued, "You didn't kill Helen. I don't believe that. But you knew, didn't you? Or at least suspected." He didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "I should have said something. Long ago. But I was afraid." "Of what?" He looked at her, and in that moment, his carefully guarded composure cracked. "Of the truth. Of destroying lives, Gwenda's, mine. Of being the man who confirmed something unspeakable. You thought Kelvin killed her?" Kennedy stood and began pacing slowly. "Helen had written to me. Just a few lines. She said she was frightened, that Kelvin was becoming erratic, possessive, that he'd accused her of having an affair. Did she say with whom?" He shook his head. "No. She just said she was planning to leave him. She was trying to find a way. And then she vanished. You confronted him." "I did." He said she had left. Walked out after Roe. Said she didn't love him anymore. He seemed devastated, but oddly resigned. And I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe it. I was a doctor, a man of science. I told myself, no body, no proof. But I knew. Miss Marple studied him. "So you stayed silent." "Yes," he admitted. "And then he left the country with Gwenda. I thought perhaps it was over. Perhaps he'd buried it, whatever he'd done, and taken the child away to spare her. But that was a lie," Miss Marple said softly. "And lies, Dr. Kennedy, don't vanish. They wait." He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the fire. "I told myself it wasn't my place. That can be sure. But in my heart, I knew." Miss Marple's voice was sharper now. "And when you saw the excavation in the garden, the remains, you knew you'd been part of a terrible silence." He sat again, weariness etched into every movement. "Yes, and I'm so sorry. For Helen, for Gwenda, for all of it." But Miss Marple wasn't finished. There's still something missing. If it wasn't Kelvin in the dream, if it wasn't his voice, then who was it? Who else had access to the house? Dr. Kennedy froze. For a brief second, something flickered in his eyes. Guilt or fear? "I don't know," he said at last, but the words rang hollow. Miss Marple nodded politely and left shortly afterward. But outside in the chill of the evening, she paused on the garden path, looking up at the silhouette of the house. She had learned long ago that the key to solving a crime wasn't always about facts. It was about people, their emotions, their guilt, their silences. And Dr. Kennedy's silence had protected more than just Kelvin Halliday. It had protected someone else. Later, she shared the conversation with Gwenda, who listened in silence. "My uncle," Gwenda said slowly, "always acted like he was guarding me. Even when I was a child, he'd visit and check in on us. I always thought he was just being kind." "Perhaps he was," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps he was keeping watch, making sure nothing resurfaced." Gwenda's voice trembled. "Do you think he knows who really did it?" "I think he suspects," Miss Marple replied. "And if we can get him to admit even a sliver of doubt, we'll find the truth." Because in murder, Miss Marple believed, someone always knows something. The challenge was breaking through the walls of time, shame, and loyalty that held that knowledge prisoner. And in Dr. Kennedy's case, those walls were beginning to crack. As the morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Hillside, it revealed more than dust motes in the air. It revealed the lingering secrets of a home built upon deception. Gwenda woke unsettled. Her dreams had grown sharper, more specific. The voice from her memories was clearer now, not her father's. Deeper, more deliberate, and oddly familiar. She recounted this new realization to Miss Marple over tea. The elderly sleuth listened intently, eyes narrowed in concentration. "If it wasn't your father," Miss Marple asked softly, "then who had both access to the house and reason to stop Helen from leaving?" Gwenda hesitated. "We barely knew anyone else who came often. There were the neighbors and Lily." "Lily?" Miss Marple perked up. "Who is Lily?" "She was the maid," Gwenda replied. "Young, a bit nervous. She looked after me sometimes. After Helen disappeared. She left too. I never thought much about her until now." This new name lingered in Miss Marple's mind like a faint perfume, unseen but undeniable. With a meticulous precision that only Miss Marple possessed, she began her inquiry into mysterious Lily. It didn't take long before a trail, faint but intact, began to form. Lily Abbott had worked at Hillside briefly in 1939, and after Helen's disappearance, she'd returned to her hometown in the north. Unmarried, reclusive, but still alive. It was enough. Within 2 days, Miss Marple and Gwenda made the journey to a sleepy coastal village in Yorkshire. Lily Abbott's cottage sat on a crumbling lane, half concealed by ivy and thyme. When she answered the door, she was a shadow of the young maid she'd once been. Her eyes watery, her posture hunched, but her memory surprisingly intact. When she saw Gwenda, Lily's hand flew to her mouth. "Miss Gwenda, my goodness, I thought I'd never see you again." Her voice trembled with something deeper than emotion. It trembled with guilt. Inside, tea was served in chip cups, and the silence between them stretched. "I suppose you come about her," Lily said at last. "Helen?" Gwenda whispered. Lily nodded. "I didn't see it happen, but I heard it. I was in the kitchen, and I heard them arguing, her and Mr. Halliday." Gwenda and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. "No, not your father," Lily corrected. "The other Mr. Halliday. George." "George." Gwenda blinked. "My father didn't have a brother." Miss Marple leaned forward. "He did. A half-brother, George Halliday. Much older. He never acknowledged him much, and George was never around unless he needed something. But he had a key to the house, didn't he?" Lily nodded gravely. "Yes. He came and went, always sneaking in when Kelvin wasn't around. He liked Helen a little too much, if you ask me." "And Helen?" Miss Marple asked. "She couldn't stand him," Lily replied. "Said he made her skin crawl. Said she wanted Kelvin to tell him to stay away. But he never did. Said family was family." Gwenda felt her breath catch. "Did George hurt her?" "I don't know," Lily whispered. "But I know that night there was a scream. A horrible scream. Then silence. I ran to the stairs, and I saw him, George, coming down them, his face pale, his hand shaking. He said Helen had gone, that she'd left in a fury." "You believed him?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "I was too scared not to," Lily admitted. "He told me to keep my mouth shut, gave me money, said it was best for everyone, and then he disappeared. A week later, Mr. Halliday took Miss Gwenda away. I thought it was all over." "But it wasn't," Miss Marple murmured. Lily's hands trembled as she poured more tea. "I've lived with that for decades. I didn't want to believe he'd done it. But when I heard she'd never been found, and that you were asking questions, I knew it was time." Back at Hillside, the pieces began to fall into place. George Halliday, a man with no real career, who floated between pubs and betting shops, had access to the house. He had an unhealthy fixation on Helen, and saw her not as his brother's wife, but as something he could possess. When she refused him, likely planning to reveal his behavior, he snapped. And then, in the chaos of war's approach and a family's disintegration, he vanished into obscurity. The perfect storm for a perfect crime. But Miss Marple was not done yet. She contacted an old friend in Scotland Yard who was able to pull up archived police files and track George's last known whereabouts. It seemed he'd died in 1953 in a seedy boarding house in London. No family claimed the body. No one attended his funeral. A man forgotten, except by those haunted by what he left behind. Miss Marple shared this revelation with Dr. Kennedy, who grew pale at the mention of George's name. "I thought it might be him," he murmured, but it was always just a suspicion. Helen never spoke of him directly, only that she was frightened and that someone was watching her. "George made sure she vanished," Miss Marple said, "and for decades her scream was buried with her bones." Gwenda sat beside her, quiet but resolute. "She'll have peace now," she said. "And so will I?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Justice may come late, my dear, but when it comes, it speaks louder than any scream." Back at Hillside, a strange stillness had settled in the air. The house felt heavier, as though it had exhaled its secrets after years of silence. And yet, there remained one final piece of the puzzle, one moment that needed to be recreated in exacting detail. The night Helen vanished. Miss Marple, despite her age, moved with deliberate energy as she suggested an experiment. "We must walk through that night," she said. "Every step, every sound. Sometimes the ghosts of memory are awakened not by words, but by movement and atmosphere." Gwenda looked uneasy. "You mean recreate the night she died?" "Precisely," Miss Marple said with quiet finality. The sun was already sinking as they prepared. Giles, devoted as ever, helped reposition furniture that Gwenda had unknowingly restored to its original places. The hall stand, the rug, the small table in the drawing room, all returned to their 1939 layout. With old photographs and Lily's account as a guide, they pieced together the past until the house looked eerily familiar. At dusk, the lights were dimmed and the rehearsal began. Gwenda stood at the top of the stairs, where Helen had last been seen. The scent of the garden roses wafted through an open window. The clock in the hall struck 7, just as it had that evening long ago. She was arguing with someone. Gwenda whispered, "We think it was George." Miss Marple nodded. "Now listen. What can you hear?" At first, there was only silence. But then Gwenda's brow furrowed. "The creak. That same creak. On the top stair." Giles tested it. Sure enough, it moaned under his foot. A quiet, almost imperceptible groan. It would have been impossible to sneak down those steps unnoticed. "Now imagine," Miss Marple prompted. Helen turns away from the stairs toward her bedroom. She's angry, perhaps frightened. George confronts her. Gwenda shivered. She says she's going to tell Kelvin everything. "And he knows," Miss Marple continued, "that once she does, he'll be banished. No more favors. No more money. No more influence." "He grabs her," Gwenda whispered. "She struggles. There's a scream. Where would he go then?" Giles asked. Miss Marple moved toward the sitting room. "Someplace hidden. Someplace accessible, where to conceal the body quickly before anyone saw." "Behind the wall," Gwenda murmured. "The one in the garden, with the loose bricks." She rushed outside, followed closely by Miss Marple and Giles. The garden was cloaked in twilight, shadows dancing under the hedges. There, near the far corner of the yard, was a low stone wall, half covered in moss. Several bricks stood out, slightly newer, slightly darker. With trembling hands, Giles began removing them. Behind the wall was a hollow, a space too deliberate to be accidental. And inside that space, buried beneath years of dirt and foliage, were the remains of a woman in a faded floral print dress. The same dress Helen had been wearing when she was last seen. For a long moment, no one spoke. Miss Marple, her eyes misty but resolute, bowed her head in reverence. "She's come home at last," she said softly. The police were contacted immediately. The garden was sealed off, and forensic experts began their work. Though the remains were decades old, Helen's wedding ring, engraved with the date and initials, confirmed the identity. It was official. Helen Halliday had never run away. She had been murdered and buried just steps from where she once cared for a child she called her own. The discovery stunned the community. Newspapers revived the cold case, calling it a posthumous puzzle, a headline that graced front pages across the country. But for Gwenda, It wasn't about headlines. It was about answers and peace. Dr. Kennedy visited Hillside shortly after the discovery, looking more aged than ever. "I failed her," he admitted. "I should have seen it. I should have protected her." "You did what you could," Gwenda said gently. "It was a different time." Miss Marple, however, offered a sharper observation. "It's not just time that changes things. It's courage. Helen had it, and now so does Gwenda." The detective's eyes sparkled behind her spectacles. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried because it shouldn't. The truth may sleep, but it never dies. That night, Gwenda stood in the garden under a clear sky filled with stars. The wind rustled the trees like a whisper, and in that moment, she didn't feel alone. Not anymore. She had faced the darkness that once haunted her dreams and found light within it. The discovery of Helen Halliday's remains sent shockwaves through Dillmouth. For decades, the town had assumed her to be another wartime runaway, perhaps overwhelmed by the pressures of marriage and motherhood. But now, with the truth laid bare in the soil of Hillside, attention turned sharply to the man at the center of it all, George Halliday. Though long dead, George's ghost loomed large over the unfolding investigation. The question wasn't simply whether he had killed Helen. It was how, why, and whether others had knowingly or unknowingly helped him cover it up. Miss Marple, ever thorough, began assembling the web of relationships surrounding George. She believed that no murder happened in a vacuum, especially not one so carefully concealed. "A man like George," she said, "leaves ripples behind. Small distortions in the lives of those around him. All we have to do is trace them." The first ripple was Lily, the former maid. Now aged and living in a quiet village, she had already provided invaluable testimony. But Miss Marple paid her another visit, this time with a new question. "Do you recall anything," she asked, "strange after Helen's disappearance? Not the day she vanished, but the days or weeks that followed." Lily wrung her hands. "Well, yes, now that you mention it. Mr. Halliday had the gardener redo the stone wall, said it was for drainage, but it had never flooded before." Miss Marple leaned in. "Did he do it himself?" "No. He supervised, though. Didn't let anyone dig too deep." That clue alone was damning. George hadn't buried Helen in a panic. He had planned her concealment, built a tomb around her with careful precision. Then there was Dr. Kennedy, a respected physician and Helen's half-brother. His reaction to the discovery had been stoic, almost too measured. Gwenda had seen it as grief, but Miss Marple saw something else. Regret, possibly guilt. She arranged a discreet tea with the doctor, under the guise of updating him on the police inquiry. "I can't help but feel," she began delicately, "that Helen may have tried to reach out to you, that perhaps she feared George." Kennedy sighed deeply. "She did come to me once, months before her disappearance. She said George had a temper, but she didn't say he'd hit her. I told her to be patient, that it was a stressful time, money worries, the war. I dismissed her concerns." Miss Marple narrowed her gaze. "And when she vanished, you accepted George's explanation?" "I wanted to believe she'd left voluntarily," he said bitterly. "But I suspected. I always suspected." "You were a doctor," Miss Marple said quietly. "You could have demanded an autopsy if she'd been found. But instead, you accepted her disappearance." Kennedy's eyes welled with tears. "I was a coward." He wasn't the only one who had been deceived, or had chosen silence. George's old business partner, Mr. Mallory, had profited from Halliday's departure to New Zealand, inheriting much of the firm's assets. When interviewed by police, he admitted that George had offered him a favorable exit, selling off his shares cheaply and abruptly. He said he needed to leave quickly, Mallory said. "I asked if it had to do with Helen. He didn't answer." Others recalled George's sudden religiosity in his final years, his frequent donations to the church, his obsession with redemption. Miss Marple found that curious. "A guilty man often seeks salvation," she said. "But confession? That's a different matter." What emerged from these conversations was a portrait of a man who had lived in darkness long before committing murder. George Halliday was manipulative, authoritative, and deeply concerned with appearances. He wore charm like a mask, fooling many, including his own family. But not everyone. There had been one voice, nearly forgotten, who had tried to speak the truth, a schoolteacher named Miss Braverton. She had lived down the road from Hillside and had often seen Helen walking in the garden. After Helen's disappearance, she claimed to have heard a scream that night, around the time of the murder. But when she tried to report it, no one believed her. George dismissed her as a lonely old woman with an overactive imagination. Miss Marple tracked down Miss Braverton, now well into her 90s. When shown a photograph of Helen, she burst into tears. "I knew she hadn't run away," she said. "She was kind, gentle. Women like that don't vanish. They're taken." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You were right. And now, thanks to you, she has a voice again." The police compiled these stories, building a timeline of George's final weeks at Hillside. The evidence was circumstantial. No living witness had seen the murder, but the weight of consistent testimony painted a damning picture. If George were alive, he'd almost certainly be charged. And yet, justice, true justice, felt incomplete. Helen had been silenced. George had escaped earthly punishment. But through perseverance, memory, and truth-telling, the balance had begun to shift. Miss Marple, in her understated way, described it best. Justice is not always a gavel in a jail cell. Sometimes it is the restoration of truth. And truth, she said, has its own quiet power. As the layers of deception were stripped away, Miss Marple, Gwenda, and Giles stood on the brink of the ultimate truth. The puzzle that had haunted Gwenda since her arrival in Dillmouth was no longer a vague, unsettling memory. It had become a full-blown murder investigation, and Helen Halliday's voice was finally being heard after decades of silence. But there was still something missing. A final piece, the last thread that would tie the entire mystery together. Gwenda had begun to feel both relief and sorrow. Relief that the truth had come out, but sorrow for the woman whose death had been dismissed, concealed, and nearly forgotten. "It feels like I've been living in someone else's nightmare," she told Miss Marple, only to discover it was my own childhood. Miss Marple nodded gently. "Trauma doesn't disappear. It waits quietly until someone is ready to see it. And you were brave enough to look." The final clue came unexpectedly, from something as seemingly trivial as a theater program. Gwenda had been browsing through old boxes left behind by the previous owners of Hillside when she stumbled upon a thin, faded booklet. On the cover, the Duchess of Malfi, Dillmouth Players, 1939. Inside were notes written in a delicate hand, but one scribble in thick pencil caught her attention. It read, "He's gonna kill me. Gee." Terrified, she brought it immediately to Miss Marple. "Do you think it's hers?" Gwenda asked. Miss Marple examined it closely. No, not Helen's handwriting, but perhaps someone who knew. Later, a careful comparison revealed it belonged to a woman named Gwyneth Roberts, an actress who had played alongside Helen in the local production. Gwyneth had died shortly after the war in an air raid, but her niece, now in her 70s, confirmed that Gwyneth and Helen had been close. Like sisters, she said, they told each other everything. In Gwyneth's old letters, Miss Marple found a single potent sentence. Helen said she couldn't breathe at night, not from illness, but fear. This revelation helped complete the psychological portrait of Helen's final days. She had been living in a prison of pretense, her fear stifled by social decorum and isolation. She had wanted to leave George to escape with her baby, and had reached out to those she trusted. Some ignored the signs. Others couldn't act. And one, her closest confidant, tried to leave a warning behind. Helen's scream on that fateful night had not gone completely unheard. Her cry was buried beneath decades of doubt, silence, and social reputation, but it had endured. Through memory, through trauma, through Gwenda. The police wrapped up their investigation with a final report that painted George Halliday as a man consumed by control and fear of scandal. When Helen threatened to leave with their child, to expose him to shame and ridicule, he acted with irreversible violence. He smothered her in the drawing room, just as Gwenda remembered, only seen through the innocence of a child. Then, methodically, he buried her in the garden and fabricated a story about her sudden departure. He played the grieving husband. He soothed suspicions. He fooled nearly everyone. Nearly. Children, Miss Marple remarked, have a strange way of absorbing truth. They may not understand it, but they never forget it. And Gwenda hadn't. Her memories, though fragmented and surreal, had always been echoes of that one tragic moment, when her stepmother cried out in her final breath, and a child witnessed something too horrible to comprehend. The community of Dilmouth, stunned by the truth, gathered to honor Helen. A memorial service was held at the local church, where her name was finally etched on a plaque alongside the words, "She was loved, she was silenced, she is remembered." Gwenda and Giles laid white lilies at the grave, and Miss Marple stood with them, quiet, reflective. "What happens now?" Gwenda asked. "Now," Miss Marple replied, "you live. You freed a ghost, and in doing so, you freed yourself." The haunting was over, not just in the house, but in Gwenda's heart. The echoes had stopped screaming and settled into peace. Back at Hillside, the drawing room, once the scene of the crime, was bathed in afternoon light. The air felt different, lighter, free of secrets. Miss Marple sat with a cup of tea, as she so often did, and reflected on the case. It had been one of the most emotionally charged mysteries she had encountered, not because of the complexity of the crime, but because of the silence that had surrounded it, silence that society had helped create, silence that had allowed a murder to walk free and a victim to vanish from history. But truth, she said to herself, is patient. It may sleep, but it does not die. She looked at Gwenda and Giles, who were laughing in the garden, finally able to make new memories in a place once filled with dread. For Helen Halliday, justice had not come swiftly, but in the end it had come. And Miss Marple, the quiet observer of human nature, had once again reminded the world that even sleeping murders wake eventually. The final chapter of the mystery unfolded in a way that was quintessentially Miss Marple, quiet, unassuming, and yet undeniably profound. After all the intrigue, all the false leads, and the shifting shadows of deceit, there was one last truth that needed to be revealed. Not about Helen's murder, but about the resilience of the human spirit. As the weeks passed, Dilmouth slowly returned to normal. The Halliday case had gripped the town's attention for so long that the news of its resolution came as both a relief and a bittersweet farewell. The town that had once shrugged off Helen's disappearance now remembered her, and the residents, many of whom had known George, were forced to confront the darkness hiding behind their neighbor's charming facade. But for Miss Marple, the case was already slipping into the past, a puzzle solved, another chapter closed. She had come, she had observed, and she had quietly guided the investigation with the sharp intuition only she could offer. There would be no grand speeches, no grandstanding. The truth had emerged in its own time, and that, for Miss Marple, was enough. One late afternoon, as the golden light of sunset bathed the streets of Dilmouth, Miss Marple sat in her favorite spot in the local tea room, a quiet corner by the window, sipping her tea. She had become a bit of a fixture in the town, her presence no longer drawing the same curious stares it once had. The townspeople had come to appreciate her for the sharpness of her mind and the gentle wisdom of her words. Gwenda, now free of the psychological shackles that had haunted her for so long, had returned to the bustling life she'd once left behind. With Giles at her side, she had found a sense of peace that she hadn't known was possible. The couple was planning a small celebration at Hillside, a new beginning for their home and for their lives together. As Miss Marple sipped her tea, she caught sight of Giles and Gwenda passing by the tea room window. They were laughing carefree and more in love than ever. Miss Marple smiled softly to herself. In her heart, she knew that their happiness was a final piece of the puzzle, a testament to the power of truth, of healing, and of love that survived even the darkest of shadows. Soon, they entered the tea room, and Gwenda, always eager to speak with Miss Marple, came over to her table. "I've been meaning to thank you," she said, her voice warm with genuine gratitude, "for everything, for helping me to understand what happened to my mother, and more importantly, for helping me find peace." Miss Marple looked at her, her expression gentle. "Gwenda, my dear, you did all the hard work. I only helped you see what was always there, hidden in plain sight." Giles sat beside her, nodding. "We owe you so much, Miss Marple. You've given us both so much more than we could ever thank you for." "It was my pleasure," Miss Marple replied modestly. "You've both been through much, and now I hope you will find happiness. The past is behind you and the future is ahead." The three sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, sipping tea, the weight of the case now settled like dust on a shelf. There was nothing more to say. Everything had been said, and the truth had found its voice at last. In the end, it wasn't just about solving the mystery of Helen Halliday's death. It was about uncovering the layers of silence, grief, and misunderstanding that had kept her from being remembered and loved. It was about healing the wounds that had festered in the hearts of those who had witnessed a tragedy, those who had been too afraid or too polite to speak up. Miss Marple, though a master of the subtle arts of deduction, knew that the real triumph was in the small, everyday moments of kindness, in the lives that were rebuilt after the storm of secrets had passed. She had long known that the most important mysteries weren't the ones that made headlines. They were the quiet ones, the ones that took place in the hearts and minds of those who had been touched by tragedy. As the evening sun set, casting a soft glow over the tea room's windows, Miss Marple's thoughts wandered back to the case that brought her to Dilmouth. Sleeping murder was not just about a forgotten crime. It was about the persistence of the human spirit, the resilience of memory, and the quiet power of truth to set things right. Miss Marple closed her eyes, her mind already turning to the next puzzle that awaited her. She had solved many cases in her time, but she knew that every mystery, no matter how small, had its own significance. In her world, no life went unnoticed, no person went unremembered. And with that, Miss Marple smiled contentedly, savoring the simplicity of the moment. The curtains had closed on one story, but the world was full of others, full of puzzles, full of mysteries. And as long as there were people who needed her, she would continue to solve them, quietly, thoughtfully, with all the wisdom that came from years of observing the human heart. Want to dive deeper into the world of Agatha Christie's mysteries? Subscribe now and don't miss the next gripping episode of the Crit Stories. Tap the bell to stay updated on all our true crime and suspense-filled tales. And let us know in the comments, which Agatha Christie mystery would you like us to explore next?